Reactive Training Systems.
Hey, RTS Podcast listeners. Thanks for joining us for the RTS Podcast. Today we're having a discussion about the bench press, in particular how to get your bench press to progress. And I'm going to be talking with the other Reactive Training Systems coaches, Ross Lepala, Rory Alter, and Jim Ellie. And we have a really good conversation about it, actually. And there's a lot to be learned, a lot to be gained from this. But one thing that I want to bring up before we get into the discussion itself is just that for those of you who really enjoy this kind of conversation, the nuts and bolts of how to improve your programming, I teach a class that's really focused around programming. We're just kicking off a class to get started down this pipeline called Microcycles. There are other classes that address other aspects of lifting. There's a technical mastery class. There's classes related to coaching and et cetera, et cetera. If you're interested in taking your training education to another level and you want to check those out, just go to reactivetrainingsystems.com, click on store, and then click on classroom, and you'll see our whole classroom list. Opening up each of those classes will tell you kind of what it's all about, who's teaching it, the whole lesson list, and everything else. So just wanted to mention that before we get into our discussion on the bench press, and I won't delay you any further. So here we are talking about how to improve stubborn benches. So, okay, let's talk about something lifting related. So what we wanted to chat about today was bench pressing and progressing your bench press in general. And I think this is an interesting point of conversation, obviously, because it's one of the power lifts. But one thing that I see is that a lot of people really do struggle to improve their bench press consistently over time. And there's kind of a list of classic advice that's given as far as how the bench press differs from other lifts. So I thought maybe we could start there and then go into a bit of more detail, so assuming that you've got the basics out of the way, how do you hone in on something that's going to work for you? So kind of the classic things that are brought up whenever you talk about differences with the bench and how the bench can be more stubborn is that the bench and the upper body muscles in general can typically tolerate a little bit higher volumes, a little bit higher overall workloads, and a little bit higher intensities. So a little higher volume, a little higher intensity is going to lead to your overall higher workload. And that's kind of the generally agreed upon, differences for the bench. And you get some people that talk about, a need for more exercise variety. And I think I've been on that boat as well. Things like that. Anything else that you guys see as just kind of common advice for the bench?
I like to the bench press, especially for females, but even for males, I think that micro loading is really important. You need to have available different fractional plates, because taking a 5-pound jump, you might be able to progress 1 pound, from the week before, and that 1 pound can definitely make a difference in terms of your stress adaptation. But 5 pounds might not be enough for you. It might be too much for you to successfully complete your training for that day with the right amount of stress and reps and load, whatever. So I always recommend to every single person that I work with to get fractional plates and not be afraid to take a 2.5-pound jump on the bench instead of a 5 or 10-pound jump. And especially for females, micro loading, 1 pound can make a difference for them. So that's actually interesting, in terms of females in competition. A 2.5 kilo jump can be too big for a female, especially a very small female who has a small bench. So micro loading and getting a set of fractional plates is really important in terms of progressing your bench. That's one of the first things that I'll do when I start with a new lifter is say, get your fractional plates now, because you're going to need them down the line.
Another pretty basic thing that it can do, but it's a little more difficult, is to actually either invest into solid bench press equipment. A lot of people that are working with RTS and other coaching companies are working out of commercial gyms, and these gyms are really just not set up for really any. There's only one type of person who can fit to that bench setup really. Usually they have to have like really short legs and have your arms perfectly set up so that they can unrack the weight properly and safely. So especially for me and a lot of my clients, the biggest thing that helps their bench is just getting better equipment, competition bench pads, competition racks, or at least adjustable racks. Like at most, or at least getting adjustable racks can be huge because it's safer, more efficient, and more similar to the competition.
I think that's really important what you mentioned about commercial gyms. A lot of the times, so I put a yoga mat on the bench. So a lot of people have trouble with like the bench being too slick and they slide all over the place. And if your base of support is not stable, and we've talked about this, I don't know if we've talked about this in other podcasts, but Mike and I have definitely talked about the shoulder musculature and the shoulder joint needing to be as stable as possible. And you know, your base of support, your body needs to be stable as well. So just finding something, even if it's, you know, maybe not everybody can afford to get, you know, a bench pad or whatever, a simple yoga mat for like $6.99, pick up at TJ Maxx or whatever, throw that over the bench. It can make a world of difference in your ability to move the load. And then the other thing in terms of commercial gyms and not having the ability to adjust the rack height, I really encourage people to find a spotter or a handoff that they feel comfortable with. So like make a friend at the gym and really train them to do the lift off the way that you need, because just getting the bar out of the rack can be so much effort that it affects your set. So two things that I recommend, especially for commercial gyms, is getting a yoga mat or even like bands that you can put over the bench. And asking for a lift off on your work sets, because those two things can be the make or break your bench progression in terms of being able to move the load. And these are just easy things. These aren't even programming things that we can do to affect our ability to progress the bench press.
So like, I think what that gets back to, both of those things, is getting back to your ability to execute, which, I mean, yeah, we're talking about equipment things, but really it comes back to executing the lift with technical proficiency. You know, if you're limited by your equipment in some way, then, you know, we don't commonly think of that as a technical issue, but it can cause technical issues. So having good equipment, I think, would fall under the category of, you know, executing the lift with technical proficiency. And, you know, that's all under the heading of, you know, good practice, like quality practice. So I would definitely second that and say that it's not, man, apparently I can't keep a train of thought if a dog barks. So.
I think you're saying so go ahead.
Well, just that all this stuff falls under the heading of technical proficiency, and you know, it's not to be overlooked, I guess, is really the bottom line there.
Yeah, and it also helps too, not even having a proper bench pad or equipment like an adjustable rack, but there's a lot of exercises that are a little more complicated that can really help progression. And if you don't have access to those, not that it's a requirement, but it's a few extra, you know, if you have a board or you have a towel, or if you can do pin presses, those are things that personally have helped my bench and a lot of my clients. And not having access to those, it really limits your variation in exercise selection.
Well, actually,
one of the big things that I noticed too when I finally got away from the commercial gyms was just my ability to kind of stay healthy when I got up and regularly trained on a regular height bench press. Instead of one that was so low to the ground, I'd always trying to get into that arch, and it just being lower put a bit excessive stress in my low back, and my low back would actually get more sore and beat up from benching than anything else. So I know that made a pretty big positive impact for me getting on a taller bench.
Yeah, if your knees come higher than your hip crease in your bench setup, so if the bench is so low that your knees are higher than your hip crease, a lot of people have a lot of trouble with leg drive and finding their arch on that. But you know, sometimes, I mean, you can't change that if the commercial gym is all you have access to and there's no other gyms around you and you can't have a home gym. So
Well, that
working
also
around it.
says how crappy some of that equipment is when a short guy like me has problems with how tall a bench is.
Yeah.
It's true.
It's feet up bench for everyone.
Feet up bench.
Exactly.
And also, Jim, in terms of equipment and like doing board presses and stuff, I didn't have any blocks or anything to do board presses. And even, they have like the bench blocks and whatever, but most gyms have a yoga block. So what I would just do was just stick the yoga block under my shirt. So there's always, and there's no excuse for anything really. At the end of the day, there's always some way to adapt to what you need to do, whatever the environment is that you're in. So just always have an open mind and look at your surroundings and see what you can do to adjust so that you can be as proficient as possible and do the programming that works the best for you.
I've even seen some people use like a water bottle, like not even anything fancy, just a water bottle. But
that's why I guess so. Like I crack up when I see people with all their like fancy camera equipments and their tripods and stuff. I'm like, I just put my phone up against a water bottle. Like, stop getting so fancy, people. You really don't need. Which is interesting because when I was in PT school, we had this project, like a group project to do in class one day, and they put all our desks together, like 4 of us together, and they gave us a paper clip, and they said, okay, this is your case, and this is what you have to create your plan for your case. So we had a paper clip, and we were like, what do we do with this paper clip? And everybody was like twisting the paper clip and like trying to make like weird things to, facilitate physical therapy. But at the end of the day, they were just like, what can you think of in your environment or with your body that you can do what you need to do to get this person better? So really, just look at the environment, like especially even coaches, just ask about the training environment that your client has. What do they have access to? What's limiting them? What's not limiting them? And then kind of come up with ways to facilitate what you want in that environment.
Yeah. So I think it's safe to say that all of us have been at this for a little while now, and we've progressed past a lot of these basic considerations that we've been talking about up to this point. So if you're talking with someone who, none of this so far has been news to them, they're maximizing their facility in the best way that they can. They're making some of the programmatic changes that we've talked about. How would you go about helping that person to coax a bit more progress out of their bench? And I don't mind starting this off because I'm excited about what I've found out lately. So I posted a video recently. I got my bench up to a 500-pound gym bench. It hasn't been in comp yet, but that's definitely the best that it's been in at least like 6 years, maybe ever. And that just has to do with some of the equipment changes that have been made in my training over that amount of time. But it's been really good, and the progress has been up. And it's kind of, for me at least, what inspired a lot of this conversation is how did that come about? And I would say the biggest thing for me has been paying attention. And I mean that in a couple different ways, and we'll kind of take these one at a time. Probably the biggest thing for me in terms of like what I mean paying attention wise is looking at my training log, and in particular the block reviews that we have available on the RTS training log. And then quick plug for that, if anybody is interested, there's a free online training log that's on the Reactive Training Systems website. If you just log in and click on apps, you're basically there. It's available for everybody. You can just log your training in there, and then at the end of each training block, you should go into the reporting section and schedule a block review for that training block. And that will generate a report that will tell you basically the character of the training block. So what exercises you did, what volumes and intensities, stress levels, and so on. And it'll also tell you how it went, like how you progressed. And what I've been doing is I've been collecting these block reviews over a substantial amount of time. I think it's over a year now. So collect these block reviews, and then when it's time for you to put together a really effective training cycle, you can look back through them and see which ones produce the best results. So 1, 2, 3, these were my best training blocks over the last however long. And you look for commonalities. So a couple things that I've learned about myself is that my bench responds well to higher intensities, which isn't groundbreaking by itself because we already said that. But I know that for me, we're looking like I'm looking at triples and heavier. So like triple at a 9 RPE load and heavier. That tends to be what I respond best to. Now, I've had other people who don't respond well at all to high intensities. They seem to respond best to kind of a more middle intensity range, say 75 to 85%. So there definitely is some individual variance there. And I think that's kind of the most important information to have. So I learned what intensities I tend to respond best to, some exercise selection things that I tend to respond well to. And the more you do this, the more light it sheds on the kind of things that are best for you and your bench. And of course, the same process would apply to squatting and deadlifting as well if you wanted to go that route. But that's kind of part one of paying attention. Do you guys have anything that you've noticed is particularly useful for you in terms of the bench?
I think in paying attention, one of the things that always helps me a lot is paying attention particularly to how I set up my upper back and create stability at my chest. And one of the big cues that I've always liked to use is to take my chest and rotate and look at the wall behind me. So I'll be in the arch and it's just that last little bit in the upper back. And it seems like that brings such a large amount of stability that when I'm at my chest, I can have a lot more bar control and position control and get it in the right spot and get power off the chest. But it's such a little micro adjustment that sometimes in the onslaught of training, sometimes you get in a hurry, like towards the end of a block, like you've been going at it for a few weeks, and like all of a sudden you're kind of down and you're like, oh man, what the hell happened? You're like, oh yeah, that one little thing, pay attention, be focused in your training, and the next time I'll bring that in and remind myself and hit that, and boom, there it is. It's like, all right, cool, there we go. And obviously we all have seen that a lot with more novice level lifters and intermediate level lifters, that their upper back and chest and shoulder position in the bench is usually a big source of technical inefficiency, and they're just sloppy, shoulder joints moving all over the place. I think that last little bit of cue helps create that shoulder tightness as well and keep that shoulder a lot more stable.
Another thing that's pretty cool with Ross's statement on just noticing the small things. A lot of times what I've noticed is that frequency of bench training helps me to pay attention better, just like with every other movement, but especially bench, because there's such a short amount of time that you have to correct for it. I mean, for me, it's like, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 inches max of range of motion. If you're only doing that twice a week, you don't have the mental, readiness, I guess, to notice those subtle things that may or may not make a huge difference, right?
Yeah.
So the more frequency for me really helps.
So I have something to add to what Ross said, and then also something to add to what Jim said. So to what Ross said in terms of upper back tightness and shoulder tightness and really setting and paying attention, especially for novice lifters, that's definitely hands down something that I find important with novice lifters. But then once they've become proficient in that, one of the things that I really find to be an issue with more advanced or intermediate lifters is that once they have that upper back tightness and the shoulder stability, they then tend to let their chest take the load. And one of the things that I've found to help lifters progress from that, once they've become stable in their upper back and their shoulders, is to cue them to keep the load in their hand, even when they're pausing on their chest. So to not let their chest accept any of the load and really just continue to hold the load in their hands rather than let their chest accept it. Because once the chest accepts any amount of load, you have to then regenerate your force to pick that load up off your chest. So if you keep it in your hands, that's going to help you off the chest particularly. And then going back to what Jim said about frequency, yes, but in terms of like how I would program, you want to just be careful how frequent, like where you're taking them from. So if someone is just benching once a week, then you want to go to twice a week. If they're benching twice a week, try 3 times a week. You know, I don't just take someone from like once a week to 4 times a week or twice a week to 4 times a week. You want to gradually increase the amount, like minimal effective dose. I think that we've probably talked about that, you know, many times, but just for anyone listening who's never listened before, just be careful with like how frequent you go from 2 to 4, 2 to 3.
Yeah.
So question for you, just to clarify your point about having the chest accept any of the load. Like you're referring to basically a soft touch on the chest and not like really sinking the bar in.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Okay.
And then I see also, and you know, I'm the injury person here, so hands down, I would say like 90% of shoulder and elbow injuries include a technical issue with accepting the load or sinking onto the chest and not staying tight. Because once you put, like, let's say you put 10 pounds of a 405 pound bench press on your chest, that's going to deform your chest a little bit. You know, 10 pounds is enough to deform your chest. When you deform your chest, your shoulder's round, it puts pressure on your bicep, it puts pressure on your elbow. And then over time, like if you're benching 4 times a week and you have high reps and you have high intensity, you have, you know, it just, that can really create a lot of shoulder issues also.
That's what I was going to add to that too, Rory, was accepting load into your chest and having the bar sink into your chest. It moves your shoulders around. It changes your shoulder position. You know, I think when you look at a video from like the side of a bench press, you should see kind of like the center of the shoulder joint not move in any direction. It should be in that same spot the whole time, and that's going to be a good sign of stability. And if that shoulder joint is staying stable and not moving, the lifter is going to be able to have maximal force production and force transfer into the bar. You're not going to have excessive movement and letting that energy dissipate elsewhere other than where you want it.
Yeah, you want to you build so much potential energy on the way down. You don't want to lose any of it into your chest. You want it all to transfer to the load on the way up. So,
you know, Ross, I want to kind of take that visual that you're starting there and go with it a bit further. So if you look at a bench from the side, we've talked about technical proficiency at this point, and we haven't really mentioned bar path, and I think it's safe to assume that you know, bar path basics are going to be commonly understood. That's maybe not a really great assumption, but in the interest of moving the conversation forward, I think we can start there. But bar path wise, we want to see the bar come back over the shoulders relatively early in the lift, and then more of a straight line press in the second half of the lift. And I mentioned Greg already, I think, but I think Greg Knuckles has a good article on bar path. He mentioned that again at the European Powerlifting Conference that I was at in Ireland. What's it been, a week ago now, I guess. Anyway, time is of no meaning to me at this point. But anyway, he mentioned it again. And one of the things that he mentioned is that some of the pictures that are shown in that article are over exaggerations, but it helps to illustrate a point. So kind of starting from that paradigm, I do think that there are some exercises that I like to put into programs that help to reinforce that pattern. Of course, the primary driver of your technical proficiency and just your strength improvement in any of the lift is going to be your competition exercise. I think that has to go without saying. That's the big rocks in the jar, and you have to have that in the program first. But I would add to that there are some exercise variations that you can do to help enhance some of those technical adaptations. So, for example, a couple things that I like to do in terms of helping to learn bar path, just reinforce good bar path and strengthen certain movement patterns and certain muscles. I like to do, this last training block I did low incline bench. So this was an incline of only about 15 degrees, I think. That seemed to be beneficial to me. And again, you're going to want to try all this stuff out and look at your block reviews and see how it pans out for you as an individual. But the low incline bench was something that I feel like I got something out of. I also get a lot out of chest level pin presses. And that's something I've done basically since the beginning of my career. And I remember I was cautioned a lot in the beginning against doing those, but I didn't really see the reasoning, so I kept it, and I think I've been better for it. I feel like it is a movement, especially when done sufficiently heavy. It slows things down enough so that you can concentrate on having the correct bar path. And like a lot of these, it rewards good movement and punishes bad movement, and I think that's, if you're looking for kind of a technical edge to your assistance work, that's kind of what you're looking for. Then a couple others, and I'll stop talking. Well, I guess just one other, incline pin press. So it's kind of a combination of the first two. So we've got low incline and then chest level pin press, and then you can kind of combine them together and do an incline pin press. And I think that works with a variety of inclines as well. You could conceivably do it with a low incline, or kind of the more typical 30 to 45 degree incline that you'd usually find.
So that's why there's incline pin press in my program.
I think you're going to be pleasantly surprised.
I think I attempted 205 on the incline pin press last block, and I was just like, oops. But I'd done 200 the week before. Oh well.
Yeah, so it's got a narrow range for sure.
Well, that's why you need the micro plates.
Yep.
There you go.
See? Probably could have done 201.
I got a question on that, Mike. One of the things, I definitely, like bar path wise, I definitely agree with the low pin press. I'm also a big fan of those. But the incline press, it had been a long time since I had done any incline pressing until several weeks ago, when we added them in there. And I noticed that it is really hard for me to have any backwards motion, and it's a really straight press comparatively to the regular bench press, and bar path hasn't really ever been a problem for me. So I guess I just felt that it was tough, with the exception of Rory's going to call me out because sometimes I touch too low.
No.
Oh, well, I thought that's what you were going to say.
No. I don't think I've seen. Oh, you mean touch too low on your regular bench?
Yeah.
Well, I don't. So I just want to go back to like the bench and the bar path for a bench press. So all bar paths, from my perspective, all bar paths are straight. The bar path for the bench is just a straight diagonal. So it doesn't. And I think maybe I'm misinterpreting what you're saying about bar path, Mike. But are you saying that it first comes back and then goes up, or are you talking about like a straight diagonal, like a totally straight line?
No, I'm not talking about a straight line. So okay. And I'm not talking about an arc either. Mm-hmm. I'm talking about like when I look at bar path for high level benchers, it comes off the chest, goes back over the shoulders, and then comes just straight, kind of the second half is straight. And this is also very similar to the technical lines that you see in equipped benching. It's just equipped is a bit more exaggerated. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that gets taught a lot more with equipped benching, because it has to be so exaggerated, is that you tuck your elbows on the way down, and when you get about halfway up and the bar is starting to slow down, you flare the elbows and make sure that the bar is drifting back. A lot of times what I see is when people push off their chest in too straight of a line, mm-hmm. It gets to around that mid-range and just dies.
Right.
Now, if you can have somebody with the awareness in that moment to drift the bar back up over their shoulders,
Right.
they can usually finish the
Right.
lift and grind it out. I would just say that that's what you want to do, so it would be better to, kind of start the lift in that moment, start the lift in that direction rather than waiting for the bar speed to die.
So I'm thinking as I'm talking about this, so I might get something wrong, but so the reason I teach or talk about a diagonally straight bar path on the bench press is because when we're working against gravity. So what we do want is a complete vertical line against gravity. That's going to be the easiest way to move the load without any other forces coming into play, right? But we also have to consider the shoulder joint when we're bench pressing. So if we came, and this is not what you're talking about, but I'm just saying if we came straight down, we'd be at a 90-degree angle at the shoulder and we'd impinge the shoulder. So what everyone does when they bench press is they touch lower on their chest so that they're not causing shoulder impingement. We always want a straight bar path because anything that's not straight is going to introduce more forces. But what we want to do when we press off the chest is move it back towards our shoulder joint on the way up so that we're over our shoulder joint and we don't have we're moving against gravity, right? As the load gets heavier and as we're near max, we definitely see the bar slide back and then come up. But I don't think that in general, when we're working with lighter loads, that we should do that because coming back first and then pressing up is going to cause that shoulder impingement. So really, and in terms of what I do and when I look at my lifters, I really don't see what the bar path that you're specifically talking about until like a third attempt in a competition. That's just what I've experienced because what we don't want is to get into this position and then press up. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. So
I've always just coached, just push it back on the way up, but you don't want to like go back and then up.
Well, I also think that there's a bit of a difference in how we cue things and how we observe things, like watching a video, and that trips people up in a lot of different settings as well. So for example, I think that's how it feels to me internally, like when I'm doing it, is to press in a slant back up in more or less a straight line. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But when I look at a video, that's not what I see. So in different, like that sort of disconnect can lead different people to different conclusions. So if I'm thinking that it should look like a slant and then I watch the video, then I might think I'm doing it wrong. Mm-hmm. Whereas if I'm, thinking about kind of this curved line that I was talking about earlier, and I see that on the video, it doesn't necessarily feel like that when I'm executing it. So this disconnect between how it feels when you're doing it versus what it looks like on a video.
I'd be curious to look at like different intensity bar paths for you and me, and like this is just an interesting topic that I like. I'd just be interested in discussing it, like, and actually looking at videos for both of us and see what we see.
Well, I think we should do that then.
Or internal cues for it.
Sure. Excuse me.
Not to cause a discrepancy in what we coach here. But
no, it's fine. And the awkward pause is more of me trying not to cough. But I did want to, in the interest of kind of covering some more ground here, I mentioned kind of a part two of paying attention, and this was kind of the second half of my observation, is that since I've not been training the squat and the deadlift as heavily lately, that's not competing for my attention. So the only power lift that I'm training right now is the competition bench. I mean, I've introduced some other lifts that I'm saying that I care about right now, but really that's afforded me a lot more attention that I can focus on my bench. So there's like the programmatic attention, but then there's also the
energy sources.
Yeah, the energy and the effort and the focus in the training session itself. And I mean, that's interesting, but I think it has implications in terms of template and template design. That as higher frequency training has become more popular, and I think for good reason, a lot of times we find ourselves benching second in the training session, after your heavy squats, or even sometimes after deadlifting. But the same sort of attentional issue is going to apply to deadlift. It can apply to any lift that's always second in your training session. If you're always doing something else first, and then you always bench second, or you always deadlift second, then you're just not going to be able to apply as much focus and attention to that second lift. And I do think that's a little bit personality dependent, which we've kind of talked about among ourselves, and that needs to expand into a broader conversation. But the point is to design your template in such a way that you have that you're able to apply that high quality attention to each lift at some point during your training week.
Well, I have a question for you. So for talking about the bench, like kind of always being second in training, my question is, so when and this is just a personal experience, and I'm sure I've had clients tell me this before, if I've ever had bench first in training, I don't feel like I can perform as well because I'm not as warmed up as I am after squat or deadlift. Now, do you think that that's something that would adapt over time, or do you think I would think that it would a little bit, but not as much as possible, because the upper, I always get cold when I'm benching. Even if I squat and then I bench, I tend to get cold even though I'm like doing an 8-rep set, and it's just because it's less muscle mass involved and less joints involved in the motion. So I always feel like I underperform if I do bench first. Now, is that something that we care about?
Yeah, definitely. It's something that we care about. And I'm overly excited about this question, actually. But I think the first part of it is, just conditional. Like I know we've talked about in the past that a lot of times your gym is cold, and especially in the non-summer times. So I think that's going to be in play a little bit, but in terms of just the internal perception of not being fully ramped up, fully awake and alert's not really the right term, but I know that feeling that you're talking about. I think that is a personality dimension, to be honest. So like if we have both at this point done the Big 5 personality tests, and we're looking into this a lot more just as a coaching hive mind. But you and I have quite different personality. Like the strong points of our personality are quite different. And I think that leads me to feel like, I'm always going to do the best on the thing that's first in my training session, because I'm bringing the most energy and focus and alertness to that. And then I get more tired as I go.
Well, I feel that way too. I mean, when I go into a training session, I'm like, well, I have bench first. I can like give all my energy to this. And then I'm like, well, I'm freezing, or I'm not freezing, but like, I just feel like tight. And just because I guess it's like less warm up sets, and the warm up sets are lighter than squat. I don't know. It's just.
Well, let me make it a little bit less woo sounding. Okay. One thing that we see in terms of different personality tests is that different personalities will correspond to different baseline levels of neurotransmitters. Dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin in particular have been, like those relationships have been established with certain personality tests. So if we think about it that way, the people with different personalities are going to exhibit different physiological outputs that then, I mean, maybe it's not quite so, I don't know, what's the what's the term that I'm looking for here, but not quite so like ethereal and just you know, being at one with the universe, kind of new agey, you know. So hopefully, you know, hopefully we have some new age people.
Well, I mean, so, you know, I've had a similar experience to you in that, you know, I did hurt my back in 2014, where I literally could not train lower body. All I was doing was like, I think I started with like 95 pounds on the deadlift and 105 pounds on the squat. So relative to my actual abilities, it was very, very low. I was still doing that every time I was going into the gym and like adding 10 pounds every session, but it wasn't wiping me of any energy. And I don't know if I was bench pressing first during those sessions though, but I mean, still, like, what's 3 sets on a squat with 105 pounds and then benching after that? And I did make a ton of progress. I think in 11 weeks, I put 18 pounds on my bench press, you know, but so I've had a similar experience in that, like, the focus of attention and all of most of my energy stores going to the bench press. But I don't know if it was, and that leading to bench progress, but I don't know if it was training bench for, I mean, can you consider that being
Right.
training bench first when you're only squatting 105 pounds beforehand? I don't know.
I
guess that's a warm up though, you know?
Right. So, I mean, it
So
does
I
kind
guess
of
maybe
solve
it
the
just
warm-up
comes down
issue.
to warming up better or more, spending more time warming up for just a bench first session than squat or deadlift first then bench.
Well, and you also forget that your lower bodies use off a good amount during the bench press. Obviously, not squatting, but especially if you have a good amount of leg drive, if you're not warming up your hips, you're not getting the joints moving a little bit. It's going to feel a lot tighter. It's similar kind of when I first started deadlifting first in my training sessions, when I had only ever squatted first. I was like, there's no way I'm going to deadlift now, right now. Like, I'm not ready for this. And then I just remembered, like, I can't just jump right into the deadlift, just like I can't just jump right into a squat, just like I can't just jump right into a bench. And you also have to pay more attention to warming up the upper body, because a lot of times after squats, you feel, well, personally, I feel like my upper body is a little bit more warmed up than if I would just benched, never squatted, because, I mean, you're putting yourself in a wide position. You're getting some back stretching in during the squat. So I think that's a really good point about just making sure you're warming up normally, not less, because you only have to bench.
Should I admit that I really don't warm up?
Well, I don't think anything good at this really warms up.
I always tell everyone to warm up.
I know, bad things to say, right?
Oh,
But
I know.
no, that's
I agree with some of that to an extent, though. I mean, especially with what Jim was saying on warming up your legs and being able to get into position. I know for me personally, plays a pretty big role. After sitting at a desk for 8 hours a day, I'm usually pretty stiff, and it takes me a little bit to get things rolling and moving. And squatting first allows me to do that, and I'll typically have more squat warm-ups than I will have bench warm-ups.
See, so this is interesting to me, that just kind of the difference of experience. So like Jim was talking about, like his baseline level of experience was to squat first and then do other lifts second. You know, so when he transitioned into a template that had a different lift first, he had to add extra warm-ups. So my baseline experience is not that. And in fact, if you go way back, I was doing like an upper lower split. And I would deadlift first, I would bench first, whatever. So when I would go to a competition, say, you know, now I'm squatting first, bench, and then deadlift. My perception was that I had to warm up the bench and the deadlift less than what I had in training. So, I mean, I think all of this is kind of converging on the same thing, that, you know, whatever you're doing first is going to provide some sort of a warm-up effect to what you're doing second. And it's important to consider that, even if it's just, even if it's not a related movement. So say, you know, squat versus bench. All right. So,
which seems like it should be kind of almost fairly obvious.
Yeah, it does. But, you know, and I'm sure it will be to a lot of people, but I think we do a disservice to the powerlifting community at large, if I can wax philosophical for just a second. We do a disservice to the powerlifting community at large if we omit things that seem obvious to us.
Especially if we're talking about paying attention.
Right, exactly. So I'll avoid repeating some of the more,
Well,
in my
actually,
mind, silly.
This is a question, actually. Mike, do you find that you need to warm up more now for bench than you had in the past when you were training other lifts first?
I don't know the answer to that, but I would suspect that that's probably the case. I can tell you that I'm more disciplined about my warm-ups now. What would happen a lot of times is that by the time I get to the bench, I'm already tired and probably running out of time. So I would make bigger jumps in my warm-ups. So essentially doing fewer. Now, if I'm benching first or if I'm prioritizing that movement, I'm able to be more disciplined about that kind of execution.
Actually,
I think with those warm-ups too, one of the advantages to benching second is I think in your warm-ups to progress at a good manner into, you know, a top set like a by one at 8, so you can take those warm-ups much quicker back to back and just load and go, compared to squat and deadlift. You might need a little bit more time in between some of those warm-ups, especially the last like 2 or 3.
I actually wanted to talk, if we have some time, just to talk about warming up the bench. I mean, warming up the actual bench, not like your pre-warm up for the bench. One of the things that I've seen in terms of talking about like being able to actually progress your bench press, since that's what we're talking about here. One of the things that, in terms of paying attention and a coach paying attention, one of the things I like to ask clients when they feel like they're failing their top sets or they're failing their top singles or whatever, is what did you do? Like, what was your last warm up prior to that? You know, and a lot of the times, especially for females, but I see this with males a lot, but not as frequently as I see it with females. I see them taking way too many warm-ups in too tight of a range to where their work set is. So like, let's say you want someone to hit, or they're either not taking a warm-up close enough to it, especially for a small female. Like let's say they're warming up to a single at 120. Sometimes what I'll see is like a single at 110, a single at 115, and then a single at 120. But sometimes what I see is that their last single is at 110, and then they're jumping right to 120. So it's actually paying attention to what those warm-ups are. Perhaps 105, 115, and then 120 would have been better versus taking that 110. So it's that jump, and also like how many warm-ups you're taking. So what's that last jump and how many warm-ups did you take before? You don't want to like wipe yourself out on your warm-ups.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. All right, so I'll just kind of pause for a second and let you guys add any final comments that you may have as far as progressing for the bench. I think I've said more than my piece. So any final words from you guys?
Go ahead,
Ross, are you gonna who's going to go first?
Right.
Ross, you want to go first?
Oh, sure. I don't know. I think one of the things that I've noticed in the past couple of years, especially once I started working with you, Mike, was I feel, especially for raw powerlifters, that the utilization of board presses is underutilized. Usually it's always a pretty dominant thing that you see in equipped powerlifting, but you don't see it too much in raw powerlifting, whereas there's actually quite a bit of benefit to using it in raw powerlifting, not only to get a little bit more targeted work at specific ranges of motion, but in the interest of paying attention, one of the things that I found with two board is that I really had to pay attention to how I was doing my bar path. I noticed when I was having problems with it, I was trying to touch on the board where I would normally touch on my chest, so I actually ended up being way too low. And once I had realized that and brought it back up, it was like, whoa, man, put like 50 more pounds on my do board in a matter of 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and that's another thing that I think is a bit, I guess we can say undervalued, and just in that you should try it and look at your block reviews and see if it's something that's that you're actually getting some benefit from, because a lot of people do get some benefit from it, even if there's not, a lot of people want to pick on like overload work, especially in the bench, in terms of like what's the mechanism behind it. I mean, we can talk about that. It's a lot of speculation and a lot of stuff that's maybe not entirely correct, but one thing that we do see is that for some people, when they add it in, their bench goes up, and that's the important thing to remember. So, Jim, I think you were about to say something, so you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'll keep it short, but it all kind of wraps up under the whole pay attention, and not just pay attention to how this feels, but pay attention to everything and realize what you kind of prefer, and also recognize whether or not you're holding on to previous ideas too much because you're not willing to change and admit that what you're doing might not be working. Personally, for me, that was a huge game changer. I mean, I'm kind of stubborn, and I think a lot of lifters may or may not be. But for those who are, it's important to realize there's a lot of things you can do for the bench, and a lot of things you probably aren't doing. And maybe because you're so hung up on a previous ideology that you once had.
Yeah, like keep turning over rocks until you find the one that moves you forward. Rory, any final thoughts?
Yeah, so just two things really. We can make all these programming changes, but if we're not executing the lifts well, it really comes down to execution. And you also don't want to try too many things at once. So you might not want to change the program, just change how you're executing. So do one thing at a time to see if that works. If you throw 3 things in there, you don't know what's working. And then lastly, don't be afraid to fail a bench rep. We talked earlier about intensity really being like kind of like an overall thing that works really well with bench. And I have failed so many bench presses, but you get some, even though it's a failed bench press, you still get something from it. There's still going to be an adaptation that comes from it. So don't get mad at yourself for failing a bench. At least you tried, you held the load, you tried to push through it, and it does have some training effect. So I'm like, what the hell, I'm just going to go for it. And usually those are my best blocks when I failed like 3 or 4 bench presses that, singles in that training block. Personally, I feel I haven't done the block reviews on those myself, but when I fail, I feel like I make more progress than, I'm not saying go and fail every day, but don't be afraid to try and don't be afraid of failure.
Right. So, I mean, I think that goes for any advice, is don't apply it in a stupid way, but
Right. Today I missed 7 bench press reps.
I know, right? Well, I started failing every set, and I'm curious as why I'm not progressing. But that's an interesting observation, and we've been just collectively programming a lot more, or I've been programming a lot more like true maximal isometrics, and I know that you have some in this block as well. So that'll be interesting to see, like, your observation paired with like a true isometric. Mm-hmm. I think
I'm scared of these coming up Friday.
Might see some magic happen.
Oh God.
So, all right. Well, thanks guys for taking the time to sit down and chat with me about bench pressing today. I appreciate your insights as always, and thanks everyone for listening. We'll talk to you next time.
Reactive Training Systems.